lushes. There was a lot of public drunkenness that occurred. Yeah. And one of the reasons, because for a city of 10,000 people, there were at least 600 places to buy alcohol.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
For 10,000 people, 600 places.
That's variety.
If you think about it, though, that's almost what we have now, right?
True.
We've got a lot of good stuff around.
We are very blessed in Portland, Maine.
So, but Maine was a temperate state.
Yes.
And very difficult to own and operate a brewery during those times in what was known as a dry state.
Yes, we actually led the state and the nation in Prohibition. There was Neil S. Dow.
Oh, yes.
Yes, he was known as Napoleon of Temperance. He was the guy that came in, when he finally became mayor, he's like, no more, you're all done. Like he said, it's over.
No more beer for you.
It was in 1846 that the law passed, but it was only a very laughable law at that point. Nobody actually wanted to enforce it. And even if it did, if you did get in trouble for it, you got a fine, a small one.
Apparently, even during this late 1800s time, when there were a lot of breweries that were coming and going during that time, and these pubs were opening and so forth, it was against the law. They were being, they were being fined, and they were being, brought. But the breweries just pursued. They just laughed it off. They're like, oh, haha, sure. Yeah. Well, we're just going to keep making beer.
Right, and they kept trying to use. At the time, I believe there was some wording in the language that if it was said that if it was prescribed to you, kind of a la what we're going through right now with other things being passed, if it was prescribed to you, you could have it. So they're we are part of the doctor's orders.
What became a very difficult time in America's history was Prohibition. Mm-hmm. And Prohibition started in January 16th of 1920. Oh. But even prior to that, because of the temperance here in the state, there were no breweries that had existed in Maine after 1910. So even Prohibition started in 1920. There was a 10-year period, and breweries had just not been able to survive and had been persecuted, and who knows exactly what, but they couldn't survive.
Actually, other states had started before Prohibition went into full effect for the entire country. Other states started adopting these ideas that we had, and they called them Maine laws, because Maine was the one that pushed the movement.
There were 13 years of Prohibition, and in June of 1933, Prohibition ended. Unfortunately for Maine, no breweries were able to start back up or start initially after Prohibition. So there's no record of any breweries in Maine after Prohibition or since 1910. By 1933, as the minute Prohibition ended, breweries started to produce beer around the country, and of course by then there was refrigeration and some transportation, and so any beer that was sold in Maine was coming from outside of the state. There was actually a couple of breweries, one very large one in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and several in New York, and so breweries from New York were bringing their beers up. So beer in Maine was basically from 1910 to 1986. There were, as far as we know, no beer being brewed in the state of Maine.
Yes, it wasn't until 1978 that home brewing, which, as we know, or we should know, or we will learn.
I know, Jimmy Carter.
A lot of people started here in Maine, started as homebrewers.
Many of us have.
In fact, you started as a homebrewer.
Many of the brewers started as homebrewers. And the same year I started homebrewing, David Geary opened Geary's in 1986. So
good year.
Those two things were not connected. But certainly, as soon as Geary's opened and I was able to drink his beer and go over to his brewery, then I was inspired to brew my own beer. And then David and his brewery inspired me to open my own brewery.
Yes, it wasn't. There was a bill passed in 1985 that finally let small breweries come to Maine. 1985. I was already here.
Yes.
You know, it seems like beer has been around forever, but there was literally no beer being brewed here in Maine when I was born. Like, there was nothing.
Yeah.
That's a bit extreme, Maine. So way to go.
Right.
No wonder we're, so happily embracing brewing now.
So now on to the new breweries.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the grandfather of Maine brewing, David Geary.
Mm-hmm.
David went to Scotland in 1984. He did have some kind of apprenticeship with a brewery over there. Like you had mentioned, in 1985, a gentleman up in Waldoboro who wanted to open a pub actually helped bring forward the Licensing of Maine Brewery Act, which passed in 1985, enabling David, once he came back from Scotland, to pursue opening his brewery. So I guess while over there in Scotland or England, David met Alan Pugsley, which is a famous name here now in Maine brewing. And Alan was working for Peter Austin.
Yep.
And they had Peter had a brewery over in England and had the ability to make equipment. And so David worked out something with Peter Austin and Alan Pugsley, and they brought Alan and his equipment and their yeast, the Ringwood yeast, to Maine and opened Geary's in December of 1986. And apparently it was the first craft brewery to open east of the Mississippi.
Wow.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. I don't know Mr. Geary personally, but I love him.
Yes.
Like, I am like
A deep love.
fangirl. Yeah.
Yeah.
You have a deep appreciation.
I do.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And even Pugsley, like him coming in and helping like get Portland to be what it is now, it's just amazing to think about, because it's just kind of spiraled into this amazingness from 1986.
Right. So Alan went on to be what he was known at that time, or years later after doing his thing, as the Johnny Appleseed of brewing. And essentially, I believe something like he has opened something like 150 breweries around the world, actually.
Holy smokes. Wow.
Under the Peter Austin and Alan Pugsley name. Many of which were here in New England because he moved here, he made his residence here. He worked for David. I think they had a contract for 3 or 4 years or something. He worked for David for quite a while, teaching him everything he needed to know. During that time, the guys, Richard and Ed over at Gritty's, had met David at Dewey's and drank his beer, and they're like, oh, well, we want to open a brew pub. And so the second brewery to open was Gritty's in Portland in December of 1988. And so those were the first 2 breweries, and again, that was an Alan Pugsley project. Those were the first 2 breweries to open in the state of Maine prior to 1990.
Wow.
It's quite amazing. It's quite amazing how, I mean, just thinking about how it was nothing. And then it was like very much a seed that was
That's
like
right.
planted.
And the seed was planted. So I'm from 1990 to 1996, there were 23 breweries that
Holy
opened.
moly.
But in the late 90s, something happened to the industry nationwide, and basically the industry went flat. And at that point, there were a number of beer sales went flat or down. The number of brewery openings basically stopped. And there were a number of breweries that closed, including a half a dozen or so in Maine.
So it seems like the beer bubble popped around then.
It popped in the late 90s. And there were a number of reasons. Economy was one. The fact that it had grown so fast was another. And distribution was another. One of the major national distributors did some things to halt the distribution, or try to halt the distribution of craft beers, because it was a competition. And unfortunately, that really affected small brewers. And again, a lot of breweries went out of business. After the whole thing in the bubble, somewhere in around 2008, breweries started back with increased sales. Breweries started to open again. Some breweries expanded. Nano breweries started up. That was a new thing. A big boom in the number of openings between 2010 2014. In the 2012 to 2013, Maine was 5th in per capita breweries in the country.
Wow.
What's led to this, some real successes in Maine brewing are, of course, Shipyard Brewery, which started as a small production brewery.
You would
has
never
had
guess that now.
Huge. I looked on the numbers today. As in the 2014 numbers, they are 25th largest craft brewery in the country.
Wow.
And 31st overall in size in the country. Allagash is not too far behind. They've had continuous, steady growth. They're an amazing brewery. They're the 42nd largest craft brewery in the country and 50th brewery in the country. Maine Beer Company is another big success. They started as a nano. Now they've had 2 expansions. Their beer is amazingly popular.
Absolutely.
Rising Tide has had steady growth. They started as a nano. They've had an expansion. Baxter Brewing started really huge and has had massive expansions and great success around New England. There's a lot of these new and hit breweries to watch, like Bissell, Banded Horn, Barrel Souls, Foundation, Oxbow, and Tributary. These are all new breweries in the last few years that are making big splashes and making great beers, and they're the upcoming new breweries to watch. So it's great to see that we're having a new explosion and another explosion of growth here in the state of Maine.
Nicely done. Nicely done. That was a wealth of information.
Yes.
Really, thank you.
So, I think it's time for another round. Who's got the third round?
Absolutely. I'll take the third round. Michael, you've told us so many interesting and fascinating stories in the history of beer. Now we would really like to hear your story way back to the beginning of how you became interested in
Oh boy,
beer.
huh?
Yeah.
I'm a 4th-generation homebrewer. Back when I was a child, I watched my grandfather in Quebec bring out a ceramic crock, and on Sunday they would brew a batch of beer and put a cloth over it, and on Friday they would take the cloth off and dip their mugs right in and drink beer right out of the crock and sing songs and be merry and happy, and I thought that was a really cool thing. And
Do you have any of those songs prepared for us today?
I do have a song.
I would
We would love to hear
All right,
that.
you have
please
to
share.
grab your glass.
Okay.
I drank all mine.
This is a song my grandfather used to sing as they drank beer in Canada back in the early 60s. In heaven there is no beer, that's why we drink it here. And when we're gone from here, our friends will be drinking all the beer.
Cheers!
Cheers to my grandfather.
That's right.
Thank you, Michael's grandfather.
But that's so true. When you're gone, somebody else is going to drink your beer. It's just like, it's kind of a really sad song.
You know, it's a happy song. It's a happy song. And the thing is, they wouldn't just sing it once. It would go over
Right.
and over and over and over.
Carry
Anyway,
it on.
so
Carry
as
on
I
the
became a young boy, my father was brewing, and I had a train set in the basement. He'd take down the train set and throw up his beer equipment and make me bottle beer and brew beer, and he made all kinds of beers, like choke cherry beer and things like that. So I never really drank any beer as a child, but in high school, around high school,
When I was a child, I did not partake in the drinking.
no.
Surprising.
So at some
13.
point in high school, I started trying a few beers, but I never did like any of the light big beers. And at the time, you have to remember, I'm talking about early 70s, mid 70s, even, Molson Golden was, or Lowenbrow.
Uh-huh.
I I don't know that name.
Right?
I do.
Right? Molson made a beer